All right, so let's start with example 1. So we are going to create an empty optional object. We are going to start by looking at using the empty method. Then we're going to, after we create our object, we're then going to check to see if the optional is empty, and then we're going to check to see if the optional is present. So let me jump out of the slides. All right, so our first example, we're going to start by creating an empty optional object. Now, I've went ahead and created these 4 example classes as unit tests. So we're going to use the assertJ, the assertThat class from the assertJ presentation to kind of quickly show some comparisons and validate what we're doing. So the first one here, we're going to create an object, create an empty optional object. Add some spaces here so we can read this. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we need to create an optional object. So you start with the optional. So we start with the optional class, which if we note is in the Java util optional. And it takes some type of generic. So we have to tell it what type of optional we want to create. So for simplicity's sake, let's just use our string class. And let's just call this empty optional string. And to create an empty optional, you use the optional class again. And you don't need to type it. And we can use the empty method, which returns an empty optional instance. No value is present for optional. So if we use empty, so no value is present for this optional. All right, so this is how we create an optional object. And if we read it, we understand the intent. So we have an optional string. So this string value, empty optional string, potentially could be empty. In our particular case, because we called optional.empty, we know it is empty. So I named it empty optional string. So again, our naming convention of our methods and our variables help to imply the intent of what the code is doing. All right, so second, let's now do an assertion to check to see if that optional is empty. Now, to check if the optional is empty, we again use the empty optional string that we just created. But in this case, we're going to use the isEmpty method. And because this is an optional empty implementation here, this should return true. So to do a simple assert test, we can do assertThat. So we can do this 2 ways. One, we can use the assertThat, and we can check that it's empty. Or we can do it this way. We can take assertEmpty is empty. However, this will simply return true or false. But if we want to show intent, which assertJ does, we want to say, okay, we want to assert this is something. So we follow this with dot is equal to true. So now with assertJ, we read this as we want to assert that and our empty optional string is empty is true. So if we run this, we pass. So good. So empty optional string is empty returns true because we have an empty optional declaration here. All right, so now how can we check to see that the optional is not present? So we can check that it's empty, but we can also check to see if it's not present. So if it's present, that means that it's not empty. So if we do is present, we'll return a value if present. It will return true, otherwise false. So if we do is present, this should be false. And we pass. All right, so for example 1, we want to create an empty optional object. To do that, we start with optional. We then set the generic for the object type that we want. So in this case, string. We named it empty optional string, and then we instantiated it with the optional.empty method, which just returns an empty optional instance. No value is present. Then we check to see if the optional is empty. So we took our variable, we called the isEmpty method, which will return true because our optional is empty. And then lastly, for example 1, we wanted to check to see if the optional is not present. So we again used our optional variable, and we used the method isPresent to verify that the optional is not there, that it is empty. So if a value is present, we would get true, otherwise we got false, which is what we expected.